When you hear IMF, what comes to mind? For me, there's one number that tells the entire story: $1.4 trillion. That's how much developing nations spent just servicing their foreign debt in 2023. Not paying down the principal, not investing in their futures, just covering interest payments. Money that could have built schools, hospitals, and infrastructure, vanishing into the gleaming offices of creditors in Washington, London, and Paris. Now, debt repayment is logical when a loan is given, but that's only part of the story. Because for every dollar of aid flowing into the global south, $14 flow out through underpriced exports, overcharged imports, and profits extracted by foreign investors. Over the past 6 decades, $62 trillion has been drained from poor and developing nations and transferred into the banks and corporations of the first world. And at the center of this system stands the International Monetary Fund, the global debt enforcer. We're told the IMF exists as a lender of last resort, saving nations from crisis. But in reality, it chains them to austerity, forcing countries to trade sovereignty for survival. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. According to the UN, the developing world carries $31 trillion in debt. Compare that to the United States, which alone holds $38 trillion in debt, and the number doesn't seem catastrophic. But there's a crucial difference. Unlike the US, developing countries never get a break. No matter how much financial aid they receive or how many reforms they implement, the debt only becomes harder to manage. And life keeps getting harder for ordinary people. Today, nearly 60% of low-income countries face debt distress, meaning they struggle to meet their debt obligations. The scale is staggering. Many governments now spend more paying interest than they do on actual development. Every few years, the same story repeats itself. A country runs out of cash. The IMF steps in, promises stability, and offers a loan. But every bailout comes with a manual on how to run the economy. And when you look at the actual results, the story turns dark. Independent evaluations found that countries under IMF programs grew far less than expected. On average, first-year growth fell 1.5 percentage points below the IMF's own projections. That's not a rounding error, that's entire economies slowing down when they were supposed to be recovering. Meanwhile, the balance of power inside the IMF tells its own story. Out of nearly 190 member nations, one country, the United States, holds veto power over every major decision. The Global North commands 9 times more voting power than the Global South combined. While it's officially a global institution, it's effectively a boardroom run by the richest economies on Earth. And that sounds a lot like colonialism to me, because colonization never truly went away. It just evolved. Instead of armies and occupation, modern colonizers achieve control through debt, interest rates, and policies written thousands of miles away from the people they affect. To understand how this happened, we need to look back at what came before, when nations were breaking free from colonial rule only to find themselves caught in a new kind of struggle. By the mid-20th century, independence finally seemed within reach. Between 1945 and 1960, countries across Asia and Africa broke free from European rule. But freedom on paper doesn't fix what centuries of extraction destroyed. The borders they inherited were arbitrary lines drawn in distant offices. Tribes were split, rivals forced together, and economies hollowed out. When independence came, there was nothing solid to build on. No industry, no infrastructure, no access to capital. Defenders of colonization often claim that colonial powers invested in infrastructure. What they leave out is that the railways and roads built during occupation led only to ports. They weren't designed to develop the country, they were built to extract resources efficiently. So when independence came, Economies were already broken. The colonizers left behind debt and division. What do you do when your country is bankrupt before it even begins? You borrow, and that's where the IMF enters the story. The IMF's founding traces back to 1944, when delegates from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission: rebuild the post-war world and design a financial system that would prevent another global collapse. Out of that conference came two institutions: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, better known as the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. The mastermind behind it all was Harry Dexter White. Born into a poor immigrant Jewish family, White understood economic struggle early. He didn't enroll in college until age 30, but his brilliance was quickly recognized. That drive pushed him through Harvard and into the U.S. Treasury, where he became one of the most powerful economists of his time. At Bretton Woods, White was the principal architect of the new financial order. By war's end, he held in his hands a blueprint that would steer the global economy for generations. The IMF began with good intentions. It was meant to rescue countries in crisis with short-term loans to help them regain stability. When a nation's currency crashed or imports outweighed exports, the IMF would step in with temporary support to fix balance of payment problems. Temporary. That was the key word. Loans were supposed to stabilize economies, buy time, give nations a chance to breathe. But as history shows, temporary can stretch into decades, and that's exactly what happened. By the 1970s, the global economy had turned upside down. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system and surging oil prices sent shockwaves through global markets. Developing nations borrowed heavily, hoping to stay afloat. By the 1980s, their debts had multiplied beyond control. A perfect crisis had formed. Policy missteps at home collided with conflicting economic moves in industrial nations, turning what started as a liquidity problem into a full-blown debt disaster. From Eastern Europe to Latin America, the dominoes fell one by one. The IMF stepped in with promises of recovery. But the game had changed. These new deals came with heavier chains. They called them structural adjustment programs, SAPs for short. Reforms that promised stability but delivered submission. The new bailouts pulled countries into a cycle of dependence. Each loan came with conditions: more reforms, tighter control. Governments began shaping their budgets around IMF demands instead of their own priorities. This was the birth of what many called the IMF debt trap. Once a country entered IMF oversight, it could never fully exit. SAPS became a checklist that every borrowing country had to follow if they wanted access to IMF or World Bank funds. Governments were told to devalue their currency to fix balance of payment deficits. Public spending had to be cut. State-owned enterprises were privatized. Regulations protecting local industries were dismantled to attract foreign investors. Even tax systems were redesigned to ensure repayment would happen on time. When these IMF-backed economies showed growth on graphs, the results were hollow. Jobs disappeared. Revenues dried up. Local factories couldn't compete against the flood of imported products that poured in once trade barriers were removed. Exports rose, but mainly from raw materials and low-value sectors. The profits rarely stayed home. Meanwhile, imported luxury goods filled shop windows in cities where unemployment was rising and real wages were falling. It was prosperity that existed only in numbers. The real winners were a tiny circle of business elites tied to export markets, trade middlemen, and transnational corporations that suddenly found bargain prices on privatized assets. As criticism of SAPs grew, the IMF didn't abandon the idea. It evolved it into something subtler but more dangerous. Now it came under a new label: conditionality, a technical term for control. At first, conditionality sounded more reasonable than SAPs. It was meant to guide countries out of crisis and protect IMF resources so the money could be repaid. But as years passed, The conditions grew harsher. To receive loans, nations had to cut public spending, raise taxes, remove subsidies, privatize industries, reduce social programs, and open markets to foreign investors. Once a nation signed the deal, it rarely had room to say no. Each loan installment depended on meeting new targets. Miss one, and the next payment was frozen, threatening economic collapse. That's how the IMF took control of entire nations. With each new condition, the IMF's grip deepened. Governments were forced to reshape their economies to keep the money flowing. Structural reforms pushed unemployment up, government revenues down, and costs for basic services skyrocketed. Tax systems, pensions, social security all reshaped for repayment, serving lenders' needs instead of public needs. Rights were sidelined, inequality grew, poverty spread, and the poorest paid the heaviest toll. It didn't stop there. Under IMF reforms, funding for public services was often the first to go. Entire generations grew up under austerity, less educated, less healthy, less capable of building the very economies the IMF claimed to save. You can see the damage in real numbers. Take Zambia. Between 2018 and 2021, debt repayments jumped from 20% to 38% of the national budget. In the same period, healthcare funding dropped from 9.5% to 8%. Education fell from 17% in 2016 to just 12% in 2022. That's what happens when debt becomes the priority. The more governments pay creditors, the less they invest in their own people. Today, the IMF suffers from what economists call mission creep. It no longer just stabilizes currencies. It tells countries how to run their economies, what to sell, what to cut, even how to write their laws. It started with currency adjustments and debt repayments. Then it slowly crept into privatizing state companies, liberalizing trade, reshaping banking laws. Each IMF loan comes with a checklist, and every box ticked means less control left for the country itself. Nowhere has that power been felt harder than in Africa, where the so-called reforms were supposed to bring prosperity, but instead left economies gasping for air. The bitter truth, there are almost twice as many Africans living in poverty today, in absolute numbers, than there were decades ago. From 1979 to 1992, the continent's GDP grew by less than 1%, 13 years of reforms and nothing to show for it. Investment collapsed, factories shut down. Africa's share of world exports fell by more than half. The continent once supplied over a fifth of developing countries' agricultural exports. By 1990, that had dropped to just 8%. In manufacturing, the fall was even steeper, from nearly 8% to just above 1%. For many nations, the so-called recovery programs didn't rebuild economies. They hollowed them out. When markets reopened, it was supposed to mean opportunity. What it really meant was foreign giants walking in and buying up everything: ports, utilities, raw materials. The continent opened up and wealth flowed out. The numbers say it all. $88.6 billion leaves Africa every year. Nearly 4% of the continent's GDP gone before anything can be built. Money that could have funded roads, hospitals, schools flows out as illicit capital flight. The continent opens its doors to foreign investment, sells access to its minerals, ports, and energy, and loses the wealth it needs to grow. It's a leak that never stops. And this capital flight only makes governments more dependent on loans to survive. Governments trapped in IMF programs feel the squeeze. They're told to meet fiscal targets, balance budgets, pay debts on time. When revenues fall short, they cut spending, first on health, then education, then social safety nets. Each adjustment meets the fund's checklist but leaves citizens paying the price. Across the continent, the pattern repeats. Austerity balances the books but drains the economy of life. It strips away public investment, weakens local industries, leaves societies more fragile than before. The truth is that structural adjustment programs were never designed for Africa's interests. They were drafted to protect Western creditors and foreign investors. Even the leadership structure says it all. For 65 years, the IMF has always been led by someone from industrialized Europe. That's how structural adjustment began, a system that promised reform but ended up rewriting entire economies. And that chain of inequality didn't stop in the global South. Once the system proved profitable for the few, it was ready to be exported elsewhere. When the Soviet Union fell, former Soviet economies were told to open up. It was championed as freedom. In reality, it was exploitation wrapped in promises. The IMF formula that once reshaped Africa and Latin America found a new testing ground: Russia. This time, they called it shock therapy. In 1992, Boris Yeltsin and his team of Western-backed economists flipped the switch overnight. Prices were freed, industries sold off, government spending slashed. The goal was to build a free market fast. The result was the most catastrophic economic collapse in modern history. The country went from superpower to survival mode in months. Prices exploded while salaries stayed frozen. Life savings vanished. Shelves filled with imported goods nobody could afford. Poverty skyrocketed, crime followed, and life expectancy dropped drastically. Factories that once fed millions of jobs shut down. And as the economy burned, a few men got rich picking through the ashes. They bought oil, gas, steel, and banks for cents on the ruble. That's how oligarchs emerged from the ruins of a broken system. Russia had everything it needed to rebuild: natural gas, minerals, metals, a skilled labor force, a massive industrial base. But shock therapy turned all that strength into weakness. When it hit, the industries that turned those resources into finished goods collapsed almost overnight. Whole sectors, steel, aluminum, machinery, were gutted. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant that newly independent countries, once part of a closely aligned economic bloc, were now on the verge of ruin. And unsurprisingly, the IMF stepped in to help. Zambia faced the same playbook. Under IMF pressure, the country's copper mines, its economic lifeline, were privatized and sold to foreign firms. The promise was efficiency. The reality was unemployment, lost revenue, and a government stripped of control over its most valuable resources. Those privatizations were carried out under IMF-backed restructuring plans that demanded foreign investment at any cost. The state sold its mines for a fraction of their worth. Multinational corporations moved in with tax exemptions and profit guarantees while local ownership vanished. Zambia, once the world's third-largest copper producer, ended up earning less from its exports than Chile did from similar output, because most profits flowed overseas. Civil groups begged the government to renegotiate. It tried tweaking tax laws, but the damage was done. Across the ocean, Argentina followed the same script. In the 1990s, it privatized key industries under IMF guidance. For a while, money poured in, then came the crash. By 2001, banks froze, the currency collapsed, and millions fell into poverty, all under the watch of an IMF-approved program. The story keeps repeating. Different continents, same formula. People tend to think the IMF is a global safety net, an international lender that swoops in to save countries in trouble. That's the story we're told. Economists, politicians, financial experts, they all repeat the same line. The IMF is there to stabilize economies, but the facts on the ground rarely back this up. The truth is, the IMF has never been about fixing budgets or balancing numbers. History shows it's part of a much bigger system designed to protect the interests of the most powerful nations on Earth. So when the IMF speaks of reform and stability, ask yourself, is it really about saving economies, or is it about safeguarding the interests of those who already rule them? History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it'll crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, and I'll show you where to look. End script.